All right. Back in business. Near the end again. On to Katznelson's chapter 10 on social policy from the Politics of Power, of course. A little bit of overlap, of course, with this chapter and chapter 10 of the Barber book, which is on all kinds of policy, but bear with me. I have shortened this up a little bit. I've only got about 20 slides, and we'll hopefully have this done here in fewer minutes than my 50 minute to 60-minute average here. But anyway, again, since we have covered a little bit of this very superficially from the Barber book, I won't go into more detail unless I need to. But when we talk about social policy, what we're talking about is the welfare system. And I believe I've discussed on one of these recorded lectures in the past, earlier in the semester, the negative connotation that welfare, that the word has in American English in particular. We view it as something bad. We don't want to be associated with it. We don't want to be on the receiving end of it, even if we need money, even if we can't make ends meet, just because of the negative connotation that we're socialized to place on that particular word. The fact of the matter is, again, and I think I've mentioned this in weeks ago at the beginning of the semester, but welfare itself, the word just literally means to be well. Like fare is a synonym, F-A-R-E, for to do, to be well, to do well. The system itself, as we know it, and again, both Barber and Katznelson are very clear about this, is that the Great Depression really marks an obvious turning point in the development and history of the welfare system in the United States. So due to the Great Depression, we realized that poverty and dependency perhaps could be the result of an imperfect economic system, right? The imperfections, the volatilities of a free market, which is to say unregulated capitalism. So the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it in the 1930s really moved fiscal and social policy onto the political agenda. Obviously, we're talking more specifically about social policy, but it involves spending a lot of money, so fiscal policy overlaps here as well. But the fact of the matter is, undoubtedly, a large welfare system was created to both alleviate poverty and to manipulate economic activity to an extent. This is why Katznelson talks about contrasting a public social policy with private social policies, right? At the time of the Great Depression and the New Deal, right, which is the policy and or consequence of the Great Depression, which was the big umbrella term for the expansion of social policy at the time. Businesses, the opinion of business was also very present in the process, right? Businesses feared that if the United States adopted a full-on comprehensive public healthcare system, for example, that would be, or pension system that one could completely depend upon, that might lead to, socialism, communism, broadly defined, whatever, in the United States system. So businesses were very keen to get involved, which is why most of us have health insurance through employment. If you're a nominal adult like me, it's through my job. Many of you are probably still on the healthcare insurance policy of one of your parents. That's how it works for most of us. But business was perfectly willing to create, as the welfare system took root in the 1930s, the public welfare system, a private welfare system evolved as well, of private companies then using health insurance as a benefit to certain employees, usually the better paid employees. But business was willing to do this in part because it also created more work for businesses, right? The whole insurance industry expanded greatly because of this from there. And then also businesses can use this as a tax break, right? It's a business expense for companies to pay for our insurance. So, we are talking about a public welfare system on the whole here, but like a lot of things in the States, we can't just ignore the fact that there are private interests that evolved right along with it. This is a photo from the Katznelson text that either you've just read or are going to read sometime soon from chapter 10. Just to give you an idea, free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. I might be a bit old, but I clearly wasn't old enough to be around at the time of the Great Depression, and I'm glad I wasn't. But anyway, shifting gears here, talking a bit more broadly or staying broad, we can talk about types of benefits. That's what Katznelson does here. We can talk of in-kind benefits, which are goods and services provided to needy individuals. And then we could talk about entitlements, which we're all entitled to if we pay into them. We're entitled by law. If you want to think back to the Barber text, in-kind benefits for the needy, there's your key word, needy. These are redistributive policies, right? We're literally taking money from those well off enough to be paying into the income tax system to then transfer money to those who don't have it via the federal government. Entitlement programs are ones, again, to which we are entitled if we have participated by paying into the system, and we are entitled to these benefits by law. Social Security would be one of these, and this would be a distributive benefit, not a redistributive benefit, to use Barber's term, right? If we're talking about Social Security, we pay in while we work, and we take out once we retire. And that money that we're taking out is not necessarily, these aren't the same dollars that we put in while we're working. We'll be taking money from those who are working once we've retired. So that's how the distribution of this works. And I've recently found, thanks to the social media, some of my parents' friends post things like, "How dare you call Social Security an entitlement?" I'm not, I'm not entitled, because that word is now so loaded, not so much politically, but socially, to talk about, entitled children or something. They don't like the term associated with it, but the fact of the matter is, that's the term legally that's used. It's an entitlement, right? Because you are entitled to it if you paid in. By which I mean, for example, since I've worked abroad for a lot of years, I have not paid as much into the Social Security system as a lot of peers, a lot of friends of mine my age who've not, hardly left the country, much less worked abroad. So, that will affect me in the longer term. I just, I hope the Social Security system's still there when I retire. That's what I worry about. But we'll get to that in a sec. So, continuing with some overview history of sorts. The 1930s again, time of the New Deal, post-Great Depression, or well, in the middle of the Great Depression, was when the AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, was established. We talked about this last time around, so I won't dwell on it. But you might recall that when this system was introduced, I think this had a lot to do with, and this is the nature of public policy making, not anticipating every problem possible, not anticipating how things would change in the long term. But in the 1930s, one of the criticisms of the AFDC was that there weren't strict controls on how long one could be a recipient, what the limits were, and this raised some criticism. But it took 60 some years to revamp the system, and that's what we got in 1996 thanks to Bill Clinton. The AFDC became temporary assistance for needy families, and I think temporary there is the key word. The government imposed stricter means testing, which is a procedure that determines the eligibility for public assistance based on one's need and income and assets needing to be below a certain level. Right, so you have to prove that you don't have the income and you don't have the wealth to benefit from the TAMF program. It's non-contributory, which is to say it's a redistributive program. You don't have to pay in to benefit. So if you receive benefits through this program, it is definitely a redistribution. And the way the 1996 reform has worked is that the federal government gave up some of its say in how such programs are administered. Now what the government does is it will pay states to administer this program to needy families. And states have a lot of leeway in formulating the policies that they want to put in place. But that's an example of an income support program. We could talk about other public assistance programs, Medicaid. is one of them. Medicaid provides medical coverage to low-income Americans. And since the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, of Obamacare in 2010, and as I say here, more on this later, Obamacare was meant to facilitate, that's the word, access to healthcare for some of the nearly 50 million people who by 2010 didn't have it. In large part because Medicaid is available again to folks with low income. And what Obamacare did is it lowered the bar. It made healthcare a bit more accessible for some, but there were still some who found themselves too wealthy for Medicaid or having too high of incomes for Medicaid, but not poor enough to qualify for Obamacare. The link here, hyperlink, will take you to yet another dirty joke laden commentary by my friend, air quotes, John Oliver, to talk about how people have fallen through this crack. Again, being too wealthy for healthcare for the poorest among us, yet not poor enough, and I put poor in quotes, but those who have too much money or too much wealth or aren't in great enough need, we'll put it that way, to qualify for Obamacare. So there we are, but that's what Medicaid is meant to do. Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, is a means-tested program that provides a minimum income to the elderly and disabled. Doesn't apply to a lot of us. But that is there. That should be a theme. Elderly and disabled. You should have picked up on that in the Katznelson text. It's for if you're a working age single person. Good luck sometimes accessing some of this assistance. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or the SNAP program, provides what's in effect a debit card to families who pass a means test. Who can demonstrate that they don't have the income, they don't have the assets to provide their own food. This used to be called the food stamp program, and you may have seen this sign out and about as you walk into a grocery store or convenience store. Not everything for sale at any grocery store or convenience store is eligible for purchase under the SNAP program. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, but that is there for those in need among us. And it's worth mentioning that poverty is everywhere. Some of you might have experienced it firsthand, much more than I ever have, luckily. But the more I teach this, and the more that I think about how lucky I've been, or how, say, when the pandemic really took off. I can't remember if I mentioned this last week or not, but I filed for unemployment benefits when I got a phone call in May of 2020. My boss at my former university said, "We might not have classes for you. Prepare for the worst." So just that prospect of asking for or receiving, because I asked and I was denied, unemployment insurance. I ended up not needing it because I didn't ever lose my job, but it was because I lived abroad and I was a legal resident of Kansas, but living in California, and it was a whole big hot mess of governance. But since then, I'm a lot more sensitive to those in need, and I do pay attention, and I notice the SNAP sign when I see it, and I take a minute and am thankful that I don't need that help. But anyway, some folks do, right? But nonetheless, in this country, the idea of welfare is one that really contradicts our socialized tradition and notions of individual hard work, right? Pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps and so on and so forth. And that's why that welfare reform in 1996 that I mentioned a minute ago was followed by steep declines in state welfare rolls. But that doesn't necessarily mean just because fewer people receive welfare benefits doesn't necessarily mean that poverty went anywhere, right? This is a figure from a different textbook that I've used in the past to teach U.S. government here, but you can see the caseload in millions of families of recipients of either was previously known as AFDC since 1996, TANF, TNAF. But the number of families shrunk by over 3 million you think, oh, that's great. That's less money spent on these programs. It's less manpower, person power, if you will, um, on the part of the government dedicated to getting help to these people. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that magically 3 million people were no longer in need of help, right? You just change the rules of who can access aid, and poof, it's restricted. But again, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And again, that's one of the problems that Larson has here. That's me, that I have, or I want you to keep in mind as you're studying this, and then as you go on in the future and you vote, and you pay attention to the political world around you. To what extent is a given policy solving or not the problem identified, and what are some other problems that might be inherent um, in the execution of the policy? How might circumstances change, and thus how might policies need to change? And there's no greater example to think about that than Social Security, right? Social Security, you've heard of, I hope. This is a contributory welfare program financed by payroll taxes from its future recipients, right? Future recipients means those who are working now. So again, if I'm sure pretty much all of you at one point or another have had an on the books job, or you probably have one now. And if you look at your pay stub, you can see what comes out every paycheck for Social Security, right? Again, the hope is that this benefit will be there for you once you retire. But the fact of the matter is, the money that comes out of your check now is paying people who have already put in themselves, who now are retired, right? What one receives in benefits from Social Security depends on um, the costs, which are adjusted through something we call indexing, right? So Social Security benefits go up over time based on inflation, and in part based on what you've put in, what you did put in while you were working, but there's no limit. So this is hypothetically, say you live to be 100, and you worked, paying into the system from your 20s to 65. Eventually, you're likely to receive more than you put in, right? That's how that works. And the consequence of this is, and combine this with the fact that, as we know, I've shown you numbers earlier in the semester, older people, particularly retired people, tend to vote in much higher numbers than younger people do, right? So by the time you're likely you will be receiving Social Security, hypothetically, you're very mindful of the fact that you've been working for, a few, 3 or 4, 5 decades, and you've put into this program, and by God, you're going to get something out of it. And given that seniors depend on the program and they vote, this is now what we call the third rail of American politics. Some of you have maybe heard the term third rail. This is a bit off topic. But third rail is something that you just don't touch, right? It could shock you, it could electrocute you, it could kill you. If you've ever been to a big city and taken a subway or a metro, that usually, often runs on electric or electricity. The third rail is that one in the middle that provides the juice to the cars. And again, if you touch that, that's bad news. And that's what the term outside of railway cars is just something that you're not to touch. And Social Security, I think, has reached that point, right? So to illustrate this, to the left, I put this from the Katznelson text, join the march to old age security, right? Encouraging people to sign up for Social Security after the Social Security Act was passed, because, as you might recall from the Katznelson text, poverty among the elderly, I mean, it was like 30-40% of retired people retired into poverty, in effect, by 1930. And that was really exacerbated by, made worse, that's what that word means, by the Great Depression. So, here's this nice, wonderful little, apply for Social Security, get your number, here you go, retire with more financial security. Fast forward to today, and here's this silly political cartoon here of a hypothetical old white guy here with his T-shirt, "Give me my country back," which should maybe allude to another recent political movement. But him saying, "I want no part of Obama's socialized medicine. and he'd better keep his hands off my Medicare too. Now, Social Security and Medicare are two separate programs, and we'll talk about Medicare in just a sec, but they function in the same way. Working people pay in, and retired people get the benefit. And Medicare is, in effect, socialized medicine for the elderly. If you know anyone over the age of 65 in the United States, they're likely on Medicare, and that is very much, in effect, a socialist program, right? It is a quintessential example of social welfare. We don't want older people who ironically need a lot more care, medical care, than younger people do, but it's also generally more expensive for older folks, retired folks, and we don't want them needlessly dying in the street. So that's why the Medicare program was created. The way it works in practice is people who benefit from Medicare, in effect, seek private healthcare providers, and their care is reimbursed by the federal government, right? So it's not a government run system per se, it's a privately run system that public money pays for. So you can walk into a doctor's office and you might not know whether or not the person sitting next to you in the waiting room, who maybe looks to be about 65 years old, is there because she's got her own health insurance through her work, if she's still working, or if she's on Medicare and that's coming through, her bill is going to be ultimately paid by the federal government, right? So you can't see the distinction in practice, but for some people, this is, if we were to use a Medicare system to cover everyone, which is something else I'll talk about in a minute, that this is the end of the world socialism, but it seems to work pretty well now. And the fact of the matter is most elderly folks do seem to like it, the Medicare system. The problem is, and this is what I was alluding to a minute ago, about the unforeseen consequences of social policy, is that Medicare's costs are rising dramatically. The cost of healthcare does nothing but go up, particularly since maybe the last third of the 20th century. Costs just rise and rise and rise. At the same time, and this again is the unforeseen consequences angle of public policy making, I doubt anyone in the 1930s who advocated in favor of Social Security or Medicare foresaw how our society was going to change. By which I mean demographically, and I'm not talking about diversity or people from different places. I'm talking about how old we are. I'm talking about how wealth in any society acts as a natural brake on reproduction. So when I say there's more elderly as a percent of the population, it's because people live longer, yes, but it's also because wealthier societies produce fewer children, right? We understand now that having a kid is a choice. It requires a lot of investment. And those of us, since the vast majority of us, 97, 98% of us in this country, do not work in agriculture, we don't need to have as many children, right? As societies advance economically, they have fewer children and they work in agriculture less. So, and people, as societies become wealthier, people live longer. So hopefully this is making sense and you're connecting the dots. But where I'm going with this is we have fewer children and we live longer. And that means we have fewer and fewer people paying into Medicare and Social Security, and more people taking out more money over longer periods of time, right? This does not bode well for the future of Medicare and Social Security for that matter. Add to this, George W. Bush, who was president in 2003, expanded Medicare, again, which older people, retired people generally like. It's better coverage. He expanded prescription drug coverage for millions of people and adding billions of dollars to the debt of the program. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but the way things are going is unsustainable here, and I'll come back to that fact too. But the cost of healthcare, again, as I said, in the back third or so of the 20th century, I have here, we see the number really start to tick up by the 70s or so. So maybe the last quarter of the 20th century is better put. But we can see as far back as 66, the numbers start to tick up. I don't know why here we see the state and local contributions to healthcare greatly vary. I don't know what explains that, but the trend is clearly in one direction, as is the federal contribution to healthcare. What the federal government spends in billions is nearly, probably now in 2021 and beyond, near 1.5 trillion dollars annually in healthcare, right? Little more detail on the same thing here, but we can see components of mandatory spending as a percentage of federal spending. When I say mandatory spending, this takes us back to thinking about Medicare and Social Security. By law, I mean, unless the law changes, the government has to pay this money out. And that's the nature of this distributive program in the case of Social Security, or this redistributive program in the case of Medicaid. But this is mandatory spending. And again, unless Congress passes a law that the president signs abolishing the program or modifying it in some way, shape, or form, this money by law mandatorily must be spent. And mandatory spending makes up the vast majority of the federal government. You can see projected for 2024, this is nearly 70% of what the federal government is going to spend goes to covering these things: retirement, disability, income security, Medicaid, but Medicare and Social Security being the two largest components of the government budget. Right? We'll come back to this here in a minute. But let's think, continuing on the notion of healthcare, let's think about the Affordable Care Act, which still is often called Obamacare, which is the popular name both for and against the 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. I note that because I find it ironic that you can hear some people say, God damn it, I don't like that Obamacare, and then like Obamacare is a bad thing, and then you can hear people say, oh great, I love Obamacare. I have health insurance for the first time since I was on my parents' program or parents' policy. And so it's kind of funny. It's rare that we hear a word that is accepted and pretty much used in same measure on either side of a political debate, right? Oftentimes people use different terms to talk about the same thing, and the term that's used indicates to the listener how they feel about the issue. But if you talk about Obamacare, you mention it, I have no idea if you're for or against it. It's all the context and tone that will tell me. But anyway, that's a side note. But what Obamacare did, it expanded. As a consequence of it, the number of people with health insurance in the United States grew, yes. But it's by no means some sort of government takeover of insurance. What it did ultimately was require all Americans to maintain health insurance. It provided support to those who could not afford it. And that health insurance that I speak of is private. So this was a real boon to insurance companies. Insurance companies were on board with Obamacare. It meant more business for them. Yes, make people buy what I'm selling, please, thank you. However, that individual mandate, the Republicans from the get-go did not like it. Republicans from the get-go did not like the Affordable Care Act, period. But the Supreme Court upheld the legality of the individual mandate in 2012. That was then struck down in the Trump tax cut of 2017. By law, the requirement that we have health insurance has been removed. So there's no penalty. There used to be, from 2010 to 2017, a tax penalty if you did not have health insurance. Now that has gone away. The law requires still that we have health insurance, but there's no penalty if we don't. But that's about as much as Republicans have been able to chip away at Obamacare, the policy. Republicans in Congress long vowed to repeal and replace it, but that hasn't happened. We'll just leave it at that. Lots of talk and very little action on that front. Democrats, I think, and Democrats, generally speaking, are pretty dysfunctional in the collective as a party. But I do think that some folks have been smart enough to understand, even from the outset, that Obamacare was going to be a step in a direction toward greater coverage. This is my personal take, and this is moving beyond the Katznelson chapter because this book, the edition we have, was published over a decade ago. But I do see uh, Democrats being led by the further left leaning folks in Congress as possibly moving toward a Medicare for all type system in the United States. Again, where um, by Medicare for all, what we would mean then is we might still go to a privately run doctor's office or hospital even, but that the bills would ultimately be paid for by the federal government. I don't know that that is the best way to do things. I don't know that I would be on board of such system. What I do know is it'd be very complicated. And to that end, if you would like to hit pause and then watch this link, going back to the blackboard there, this is another John Oliver clip. I apologize in advance for the dirty jokes, but he does a very good job of explaining with a lot of caveats, pros, cons, cost, and whatnot of a Medicare for all system in the United States. But is it worth thinking about? Well, let's look at this data here. This is from the Katznelson chapter again. And you can see in total, and I'm sorry here that I don't have a heading here, but this is collective public and private spending on healthcare as a percent of GDP, right? The United States spends nearly 17, 18, 19% any given year of all the money spent in the economy. Nearly a fifth of it goes to healthcare. Okay. And surprisingly, about half of that is public spending. Now, a lot of that is Medicare because, again, old folks are expensive to keep healthy, but we've got laws in place that mandate that that must happen. And then the public spending would also be Medicaid. This would also be Veterans Affairs spending on healthcare. The bulk of what's spent here is private spending, but combine this together, and we have a system that might not be as cost effective as we would hope, right? I've lived in Portugal, I've lived in Spain, I've lived in Turkey, I've been to doctors in all of those places. It's not that different than in the United States, and I sometimes wonder where's all the money going, right? But if you have watched the John Oliver link, you've seen that nearly about 2 million people in the United States work in the insurance industry. And if we were somehow magically to do away with that, this would have its own consequences reverberating throughout the economy. So I'm not telling you what to think here. I don't even know what is best. I do seem to think that the system in this country, at the very least, could be more efficient. My overall point here in talking about public policy is that there are no easy answers, right? And no one has a crystal ball. Which, again, to reiterate my earlier point, I don't see those who advocated for Social Security and Medicare going back to the middle of the 20th century uh, could have predicted how demographically our country is going to evolve, right? That eventually we're going to have more retired people than young people working in the economy paying into the system. So that's why making such changes is so tricky. It's really impossible to say with certainty what's going to happen. But again, more information here. Government social spending as a percent of GDP. So this is moving beyond healthcare. This is healthcare spending and then all other social programs that we've discussed. This works out to be nearly 20% of the economy, a lot less than places like France and Spain and even the UK, but still a lot more than other countries like, say, Australia and Canada, Israel and Korea. The top two, at least, Australia and Canada, I know have national healthcare programs. So the broader picture thing to take away with, I want you to think about in the longer term. How do we fix this, right? Things to think about. This very simple, I don't know what we call this, a graph here, where you see scheduled tax revenue in orange as a percent of GDP staying around 5, briefly over and then below, and then the cost of Social Security rising, right? Um, the distance between those two lines is money that has to come from somewhere, right? The federal government will borrow this money likely and then pay interest on what's borrowed, but that is not that doesn't solve the problem, right? It solves it in the short term, but it doesn't make the problem go away. It's like borrowing money to pay your credit card. It's not, what you need to do is generate more money. So how do we do this? We could look at some survey data here, and this is from again one of these other textbooks that I teach from or have taught from, but this information I think is useful to what we're thinking about here. How about increasing income above $118,500? Right now, that's the cap. On earned income, you don't pay any Social Security tax on top of that. So if you earn $120,000 in a year, you will only pay Social Security tax on that first 118,500. So an easy way to bring in more money to the Social Security coffers would be to raise that bar. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of us as individuals don't make that much money in a year. That might be why 55% of surveyed Americans think this might be a way to go. 23% are opposed to this, and for whatever reason, maybe they make more than that. Maybe they think they'll make more than that. The fact of the matter is, most of us don't, and most of us won't. But there we go. It's an option, one way to alleviate the pressure on the system, the shortfall of money that the U.S. government doesn't have and needs to pay out. We could raise taxes just in general on high income earners, and that could be, say, on corporate gains tax as well, on money that wealthier people earn from investments, because most real wealthy people earn most of their money through investments, not on wage and income, traditional income. Other things we could do, say perhaps, as I think out loud, would be to increase the retirement age. Right? And some European countries have started to do this, raising, say, from 65 to 67, 68, 69, 70, when you can start accessing Social Security or Medicare. But again, we run up against another problem. That will directly affect retired people, and those folks vote in much higher numbers than anyone else, right? And you can see that for most of us, 56% right here in this green bar, keeping benefits as they are is pretty important, right? About a third of us say that we need to reduce the budget deficit. But if we're not willing to reduce the benefits that are paid out in Social Security and Medicare, then the only way to solve this problem here is to raise taxes. And I don't know that we're going to want to do this. Thinking more immediately about working aged people, and many of you, I'm sure, have at one point or another had a job that paid minimum wage. I don't know that I ever had a job that paid the minimum, but I know, say in the 90s, I had jobs that didn't pay much more. The very late 90s, that is, or early 2000s, when I was finishing high school and college here. But I put this in, and this is my last slide, but I want you to think about this. Another way to maybe alleviate some of the problem and tension in this social system of ours is raising the minimum wage, which hasn't been raised. And I think it's telling. I know this book was published nearly a decade ago, but it should be meaningful to you that in that time the minimum wage hasn't gone up. It's still $7.25. Now, a lot of states have raised the minimum wage on their own, but if we look as Katznelson did here, pegging the minimum wage to $1996 as a constant, this gives us an idea of how the minimum wage has gone up and down in real purchasing power terms. In 1959, the minimum wage was $1 an hour, and that in 1996 dollars at the time would be the equivalent of having $5.39. Right now, the minimum wage at $7.25. In 2012, it wasn't even $5. So in real dollars, I guarantee you, in the 2020s, minimum wage at $7.25 in 1996 dollars is closer to $4 than it is to $5. But think about this: if the minimum wage were higher, more money would come out of folks' paychecks. Now, not a lot at the minimum, but everything helps. If wages were a bit higher, if the minimum wage was higher, we'd have people paying more into the system, and we'd also have fewer people in need of social support. And I'll leave you on this note. The best predictor of whether or not a working age person is in need of federal social benefits is whether or not they have a low wage job. If you work at Walmart, if you work at a gas station, you work at some other form of convenience store, low end retail, it's likely that you don't make ends meet. Especially if you're, say, a single mother, single parent with kids, with a low skilled, low paying job. Uh, it's the way you're going to need help. You're going to need help, and I would argue that and it shouldn't be that if you're working an honest job, 40 hours a week, if the system isn't going to pay you enough to provide a modest place to live, and food in the belly of you and your kids, then maybe there's a problem with the system. Right. So, but that the minimum wage hasn't gone up at all in over a decade, is really just indicative of who holds power, and in whose interest policies are made. Right. So, I mean, the fact that Walmart has people on staff, on site, who will tell employees who ask for a raise because they can't make their ends meet, they'll have an HR person at their place of employment, Walmart in this case, explain to them how to get federal benefits, how to get state benefits, welfare benefits, right, while keeping their job. But that's the system we live in. Okay. So, you think about what, come up with your own evaluation of the world around you. I'm just trying to give you some things to think about. But there we are. That's social policy. I'll see you next time for foreign policy, and we're about done. Take care.